Welcome back to the Gestalt Get Together. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing Gestalt language processing, the autistic neurotype, the importance of musical language and psychoacoustics, and then how our field is responding to this growing world and ecosystem of GLP discourse. Whether you're joining me for an interview episode or a research deep dive, I am thrilled to be sharing my passion for working with GLPs with you. My name is Corinne Zmoos. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I love investigating psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in Gestalt language processors. I absolutely love GLPs. I hope that love comes through. I work with them every day. And I call myself lovingly skeptical because I want more information, I want more data, and I want more evidence. I basically live in the journals. I love research. You don't want to know how many tabs I have open at any given moment. My goal is to synthesize exciting ideas from language, music, and neuroscience researchers so that you can grow your knowledge base and feel more confident working with GLPs. Today, we're going to go back in time a little bit and look back at what we might consider one of the seminal texts when it comes to informing, especially Marge Blanc's work around GLPs. And we're going to be talking about some of the initial ideas in Ann Peters' work, Units of Language Acquisition. This podcast recording is 1 hour, 30 minutes, and it's offered for 0.15 ASHA CEUs. But let's get into the good stuff. Once again, we are talking about some of the basic ideas from Ann Peters' 1983 work called Units of Language Acquisition. And something that's great, in my opinion, is that this entire text is available for free so that you can take the time, if you're interested, to read it. It is a bit dense, but I find it extremely informative, especially if you have any interest in linguistics, which if you're a speech language pathologist, I hope you have at least a cursory interest in linguistics. I know I certainly wish that I had more formal training in it or got more formal training as I was entering into the world of speech language pathology, but I get to explore that interest now. So I definitely recommend reading it when you have the time. And I know that as an SLP or maybe a parent who's listening in the playback, time is hard to come by, but it's a really interesting read, especially when we think about the history of our field. I don't think a lot of us learn about the history of our field very often. So what would I like for you to come away with from this episode? I've got 3 learning outcomes I'd be eager for you to come away with. Number 1, I'd love for you to be able to define the following terms: heuristic, segmentation, and extraction. I would also be interested in you coming away with the ability to describe at least 3 heuristics that children may use to extract units of meaning or language units from all of the spoken input that we tend to be immersing them in, especially in our line of work. And finally, I would love if you would be able to explain at least the basics of how slot and frame relationships can act as supportive mechanisms for the language acquisition process. So our main terms to listen out for are heuristic, segmentation, extraction, and then slot and frame. And the episode will generally go in that order: heuristic, segmentation, extraction, and then slot and frame. So keep an ear out for those. So let's talk about first extraction. I want you to think about a very young child, very young, encountering the acoustic world around them. Their life, and this is for hearing children, I want to make clear. They're hearing the people around them producing all these funny noises all the time from all these different sound sources in different directions, at different pitches, at different distances. And some of the noises coming out of their mouths have tone. Sometimes they hear their parents chewing or their grandfather coughing. And what's the difference between sneezing and talking? It's a lot of information. And I want you to just imagine what it might be like to be this young child trying to make meaning out of all this raw acoustic and visual data and make meaning of it. It's hard because us sitting here with our high level abilities, we have the explicit ability to talk about talking. We have language about language. We've got all these meta linguistics to make sense of it, but just Try to imagine what it might be like for a child who doesn't have the explicit ability to talk about morphemes and articles and syntax the way you and I can do now. And they are trying to make meaning of this sound soup all around them. Children aren't provided with an organized document, or, as Ann Peters said, a dictionary of morphemes and syntactic structures that they can just pull out, organize, and analyze. Instead, what children who are hearing children get are these intermittent streams of speech. And these streams, they vary considerably in length, intention, and intelligibility. Now, from this mysterious stream of acoustic information paired up with visual information, something really remarkable happens. A child has to do this impressive job of extracting pieces of what they're hearing to try and make sense of them. Now, what they successfully pull out and extract, in whatever form that particular child deems as an important unit. Now, we also have to think about what they pull out and they deem important is also going to be based on the constraints of their sensory system, the constraints of their neurology, and the constraints of their environment. So based on those constraints, they're going to successfully extract what their brain thinks is meaningful and then interpret it, preserve it, and encode it for the future. This is a huge job. This is a complicated job. This is sometimes beyond comprehension. You know, I talk about language all day. I think about language all day, but when I really sit back and think about it, oh my goodness, this is an impressive task that happens for some children very young in an almost effortless way. Extraction is the process of pulling out linguistic units and structures from that incoming stream. Now, adults who interact with children, or maybe most adults, we take for granted that we know where the breaks are between words. We know where the breaks are between sentences. And for some of us, we know where the breaks are between morphemes and phonemes. It is so natural, it's so ingrained for us, especially as speech language pathologists, where this is what we think about all the time. But children, and especially, I would argue, neurodivergent children and autistic children, for whom the sensory environment, which includes complex acoustics all the time, I'd argue that for these kids, the sensory environment can make attending to linguistic input challenging. And these children, I don't know about you, but I work with mostly neurodivergent kids, they have an even more daunting task of making meaningful divisions between words, phrases, and sounds. And there's interesting research about neural oscillations that backs this up. It backs up the challenge that autistic individuals have parsing between syllables and perceiving how phonemes fit into syllables. And so we've got brain-based research to back this up. Now, this is a task. All of this extraction that we're expecting children to do and autistic children to do, this is a task that must happen in the flow of real time. It is happening in the flow of real-time events, and it is against all other sensory competition that's happening outside their body, but also inside their body too. There's a lot of competition going on for their sensory attention. And that makes me think, and I don't know if you have GLPs like this in your life, who love watching videos, who love watching it on repeat, who love rewinding, fast forwarding, slow-mo, fast-mo. It makes me think about how they found a way to not have to process it in real time necessarily. They have this chance through technology to make a language moment last as long as they want it to stretch out a language moment, to study it, to live in it again and again and try and make sense of it. Whereas GLPs throughout most of history, they heard something once and that was all they had. So I know technology can be kind of a tricky subject, but my goodness, does it let language live on in a way that is so helpful sometimes. Now, something that Peters talked about in units of language acquisition is how it would be unreasonable and pretty unfair to expect a child to extract units of meaning, at least initially, that perfectly line up with the general consensus of adult language. We might take for granted and have a consensus that book has a pause on each side and we extract that as a single unit and that as a word. But for a child who is trying to figure everything out, again, in this language concoction all around them, it makes sense that they might make cuts and breaks and extractions in places that we wouldn't expect. And in my opinion, how exciting and fun and interesting for children to extract units in ways that surprise and delight us with their attempted logic. I'm going to give you some examples later in the episode of that attempted logic that just brings me so much joy and delight. And there's even an example that happened just a couple of hours ago. And I looked at the dad and I said, "Can I please tell this in my podcast tonight?" And he said, "Absolutely," because it's one of the funniest ones I've ever heard. That logic that I'm speaking to is what I want to nod to and show appreciation for when I'm referring to one of these seminal texts that inform our growing discussion of Gestalt language processing, which is again Ann Peters' 1983 work, Units of Language Acquisition. One linguist who outlined possible heuristics of language acquisition was Ann Peters, and I want to tell you a little bit more about her. Ann Peters received her PhD in linguistics in 1966 from the University of Wisconsin. Her dissertation was entitled A Computer-Oriented Generative Grammar of the Xhosa Verb. Xhosa is a Bantu language, and it's indigenous to Southern Africa, and it's one of the official languages of South Africa and Zimbabwe. Ann Peters has been a professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, since July of 1984. And her research focused on the language acquisition process of children, and it had two areas of focus that are quite relevant to today's topic. The first area of focus that's relevant was the intersecting influences of cognition, social environment, and biology, neurobiology, on language development. And the second area of focus for her that's quite relevant is the importance of speech formulas. I'll be talking a lot about formulas later. The importance of prosody, and if you know me, you know that prosody is the name of the game, as well as something called verb routines as children are acquiring language. Now, when it comes to units of language acquisition, let's talk more about this work. And like I mentioned, it's available for free. And if you're here in this live podcast recording, the link to that free PDF is in the chat feature. So in 1983, Peters published what is now well known in the GLP community, Units of Language Acquisition. This publication had an aim to challenge the assumptions of that time that language expansion in a word plus word fashion, single word plus single word, and then word plus word plus word, so on and so forth. So she was trying to challenge that assumption that it was the sole pattern of language development, which at that time was kind of a prevailing theory. Peters presented her conceptualization of Gestalt processes and how those may fit into and complement the current theory of the time, which was primarily analytic. And so Ann Peters wasn't coming in and saying that the current conception is wrong. She was saying, hey, what else might be happening here? Which kids might we be missing with the word plus word conception? Peters described these early utterances of children that were rich, they were complex, they were prosodic, and they did not match up to those 1 and 2 word expectations of word plus word development. Now, she talked about this other process, about it kind of separating morphosyntax, which is word plus word, separating that from this idea of what we call linguistic units. And this word units comes up so often when we're talking about GLPs. So she's saying, let's separate these out and talk about these a little bit differently. Morphosyntax, morpheme plus morpheme within greater structures, versus, at least initially, linguistic units, which don't yet have morphosyntax. And these are also what we would call gestalts, these initial units that are extracted. And when we're thinking about gestalts, we could refer to gestalts as chunks or wholes that are unanalyzed. We don't have morphosyntax yet. They're unanalyzed, stored in a child's mental lexicon as a whole, and then later on analyzed and broken down to be used in new linguistic ways. Now, here is a quote from Units that I love, and I want to share the whole quote. I love the way that Ann Peters writes. So, start quote. I propose in this book that this phenomenon is a manifestation of one of the central processes in all early language acquisition. This process is the extraction of pieces or units from the speech stream in which the child is immersed. Since the child does not know the language, it is unreasonable to assume that the first units she or he extracts will coincide exactly with the words and morphemes of the system. On the other hand, it is reasonable to assume that at the earliest stages, there is a cognitive limitation constraining the child to processing, for example, extracting and producing, what to the child is one unit at a time. For production, at least, it has been implicitly assumed that this limitation exists. Certainly, the existence of a, quote, one-word stage of language acquisition is accepted without question by researchers in the field. This stage, however, has been more accurately labeled the one-unit stage. Finally, recognizing that children may be extracting phrases as well as words as their first unit can explain the wide range of variation in the size of these units, measured in conventional words or morphemes or even syllables. Thus, one child's early vocabulary may consist primarily of one-word labels, whereas another's may contain a higher proportion of multi-morphemic expressions. End quote. And these multi-morphemic expressions are often what you and I know and love as gestalts. Now, in the Units of Language Acquisition, as I was reading it for the first time, something that stood out to me most were the set of heuristics that Ann Peters described. And when I was reading through these heuristics, it really helped me think more deeply about the utterances I was hearing the GLPs I was working with producing, especially the very interesting things that they extracted and the very interesting errors that they make. But I've also found these heuristics so helpful when I'm working with other populations, late talkers, but also just with typically developing kids who say these wonderfully adorable and logical errors. And it's so fun and it's so exciting to be able to know what heuristic or mental shortcut they were probably using to produce that very sweet and logical error. So let's talk about these heuristics. But first, what is a heuristic? A heuristic is any cognitive technique or problem-solving approach that contains a method that is not perfect. So a cognitive technique or problem-solving approach that contains a method that is not totally optimized, not necessarily rational, but is for all intents and purposes a good enough approximation or substitution. So I talked about a lot of mental shortcuts and heuristics in previous episodes when I talked about cognitive biases. And also logical fallacies. This talks a lot to mental shortcuts. We're trying to make sense of information in ways that might have flaws, they're imperfect, or they're not totally optimized. And so this happens too in language acquisition. Heuristics can be thought of as mental shortcuts for getting results as quickly as possible when there are time constraints and information constraints. And I think that heuristic is a great term to apply to a child's mind because in the language acquisition process, especially before technology, a child's mind is doing the very best it can to understand sonic and visual input with continuous time constraints and without the ability to engage with the specific rules about language yet. And so a child is always working with time constraints and information constraints. Of course, heuristics would likely come into play. So to start off, let's talk about 5 heuristics for extraction. Let's think back to what extraction meant. It's that pulling out of linguistic units. And Peters described 5 heuristics around saliency. Now, what is saliency? Saliency is the quality of being particularly noticeable or important. When something is salient, it is noticeable. When something is salient, it is important. Saliency is prominence in a sensory field. Now, considering how much a child has to pay attention to in any given moment, especially a neurodivergent child, autistic child, who has a wider perceptual array when it comes to sensory information, Peters argued that saliency cues in speech input allow a child to make decisions. And they make decisions about what sounds are the most important to select, encode, and store. So heuristics are decision-making devices. And these are decision-making devices, again, that have to happen because of time constraints and information constraints. And I think it's important to emphasize that saliency heuristics, the 5 I'm going to talk about, as well as some heuristics that are come up in the next section, they interact with one another and they can have a reinforcing effect on one another. So I'm going to give examples where a certain heuristic may be at play, and you might think, oh, but wouldn't that also include the other heuristic? Probably. There's probably many heuristics going on at any given time, even beyond these speech ones, for a child to make sense of the sensory bombardment that is everyday life. Now, in my opinion, Gestalt language processors benefit from a combination of these saliency cues. And I'm hoping that you'll start to see the connection between these 5 heuristics and the therapy techniques that you may already be doing to leverage them. And if you're not already doing therapy techniques intentionally to leverage these heuristics, I hope that you'll come away with at least 1 or 2 from this episode to try out with the GLPs in your life. So what are the 5 saliency heuristics? First, I'm just going to list them out, and then we're going to go through them one by one. The heuristics are meaning, silence, suprasegmentals, tune, and rhythm. And those last 3 are some of my favorite things in the whole world. I love tune, love rhythm, and I love suprasegmentals. But let's go in order. I'm going to leave my favorites for last. Number 1, the saliency heuristic of meaning. So the first saliency heuristic is meaning, which refers to a child's proposed tendency. And remember, a lot of these are just proposed ideas around language. A proposed tendency that children extract sound sequences or units that have a very clear connection to the context. The meaning is so clearly tied to the moment it was heard in. Now, the primary example I think about with the meaning heuristic, I think the easiest one to explain, is the category of interjections. When a child falls and immediately hears a parent go, "Oh no, are you okay?" in a concerned vocal timbre, there is a clear connection between the concern, the pain in their body, and the surprise of that moment. So the vocal timbre behind the interjection, "Oh no," lines up with the pain and surprise that child's body might feel. We'd argue that this may be a heuristic of meaning because there's a clear connection between the feeling and what is happening in that person's voice as they're making the exclamation or the interjection. This may make, oh no, easier to extract as a unit because it's related to the meaning of the moment of that accident. Now, I think about this in maybe opposition to, let's say that same child falls, but their parent says in monotone, "You struck your tibia on the concrete. Let us ensure that it has not caused a contusion." That may not have the clearest lining up of the emotion and the meaning to the context, because it may not reflect the surprise, the concern, the pain in the voice. And it may be more challenging for that child to be like, okay, what can I extract from what my parent just said? Whereas, oh no, definitely has saliency of meaning. Now, one of the caregiver utterances, that first one, "Oh no, are you okay?" It just has this clearer connection to the event of falling itself, while the other one has this complex set of ideas that are less emotionally tied to the immediate context. The second one about the tibia and the contusion and the concrete, it has a lot of very interesting ideas and great vocabulary for the future, but it is likely harder to extract anything that is going to be encoded and stored for future use, especially if a kid is surprised and in pain. Now, another example, let's say that a child sees a giraffe for the first time and then their dad goes, "Whoa, it's really tall," in an awe-filled voice. There might be a clear connection between this novel sensory experience of perceiving this giant creature and then the timbre in the dad's voice of "whoa" in that interjection. So whoa might be easier to extract. Whereas if the dad instead said something like, "Oh, wow, there's so many, look at all the vertebrae that are in that neck," it's not necessarily lining up the with how like the meaning can line up with the emotion in that moment. So like the context doesn't necessarily clearly click into what that child is hearing and saying, at least in the early stages. Now, in my opinion, sound effects and onomatopoeia also fit this heuristic. These sounds happen at the same time or immediately following an occurrence or the sighting of an object or an animal that makes the sound. So let's say that a child drops an object on the floor and then the nanny goes, "Bam." They usually say "bam" right after that occurrence happened. They're not going to say it 5 minutes later because there's not going to be that clear connection for anybody there. You see a cow at the farm, and then, your cousin goes "moo." You're seeing it, you're hearing it. There's a line up there. Things like whoosh, beep, beep. There tend to be clear connections between onomatopoeia, sound effects, and interjections because the child is hearing this utterance at the same time that they're seeing and experiencing it. There's a nice matchup. We're not talking about the distant future or the distant past. It's a very right now, present moment kind of sound and utterance. Now, what are some techniques that we as speech pathologists can use to leverage the heuristic of meaning? And I also want you to be thinking about, oh, how do I already do this? Because you're very likely already leveraging the heuristic of meaning in a lot of the things that you're doing. But now you are able to talk about it in a different way. So one, model utterances that line up with the same exact moment an event is happening. Can you layer the language on top of the moment? I think about it like laying a blanket on top of a bed, gently, whoosh. Can I layer that meaning on top of the moment? Now, if you can't model at the exact same moment that something happens because you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, I recommend modeling that potential gestalt immediately after there's an occurrence, immediately after there's a sighting of something. So you can try and package that information as closely together as possible. Now, for early stage Gestalt language processors, I recommend not talking about the distant future and not talking about the distant past. Because if we're trying to tap into the heuristic of meaning and clear connection to that moment, Talking about the distant future and the distant past, there's not going to be that sensory lineup because the child, when you think about a lot of children, are living truly in the moment. They're not necessarily thinking about the future and the past. So I say, let's give them language for the present experience. What are they thinking about right now? Our second saliency heuristic is silence. And this is one of my favorites, and it is one of the hardest, most uncomfortable ones for a lot of people on a child's team to implement. So the silence heuristic, what Ann Peters talked about, is this is a child's ability to recognize a linguistic unit that is bound by silence on either side. Now, this may speak to why some GLPs acquire really long utterances that shock us for their age. How does this child know the entire movie script? How do they have that entire line from that movie? Or how can they sing every lyric to an entire song after only hearing it once, but they can't say mama? They heard a string of sounds related to the current context or emotion, or that garnered their interest, and it was marked by clear silence on either side. It was bound by silence, and therefore their brain said, "Thank you very much. That is a unit, and I would like to keep that forever in my brain," without the ability yet to segment what they heard in that unit. Those silent moments on either side acted as acoustic markers for extraction. Now, this might also help explain the confusing, for some, phenomena of why some GLPs sometimes have hundreds of single word gestalts. Think about it. Their caregivers, their teachers, well-meaning, have been pointing and naming single word nouns for months, if not years, with clear silence on either side. And so they have all these single word gestalts, but they don't yet have the ability to do anything else with them. They just exist as that single word gestalt, bound by silence on either side. Now, silence, I argue, is critical when modeling with GLPs. I think it is an active ingredient in creating the ideal acoustic conditions. Now, therapists and parents in the dominant Western speaking culture, we talk a lot. We talk so much. We narrate, we drill with questions. Don't get me started on questions. We prompt, we quiz. It is all so well-meaning. For some children, that is incredible fuel and a wealth of raw material, and they just effortlessly take it all in and extract, segment, ready to go. But for some GLPs, and I know for the clients on your caseload where you're like, oh my gosh, I need help. I need help with what to do. That Western dominant speaking culture of like narrate, quiz, prompt, it may not be providing the ideal sonic boundaries and cues for extraction to occur. And it may actually be extremely taxing to memory to not have enough rich silence to demarcate what the units are. I think about, and there's so many interesting connections with second language learning and GLPs and just, I mean, all language acquisition, but I think about, I'm always trying to come back to my own experiences to better understand what a child might be experiencing. And I always recommend for therapists and parents to think about their own experiences trying to learn a second or third language and where it's challenging for them and what strategies help them. So I think for me, I'm learning Farsi. I extract new utterances in Farsi so much better when my family members provide clear silence markers for me around an utterance, when there's silence before and after. My brain, it just really, really helps. Versus when they speak to me in full consecutive sentences, even if their prosody is on the money, they're pointing at the thing that they're talking about, I find that silence, those boundaries, it really helps my memory and processing. And so this is something that you might have experience with in your own language learning. But I definitely try and bring this in with GLPs to help them notice, where are the boundaries of this, and can I extract this as a unit? So what techniques can we bring in to improve the silence heuristic? Number one, after you model a phrase, take a breath and just kind of settle in. I know personally, and a lot of people I talk to, there's kind of that anxious feeling to keep talking and keep saying things. Language, 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 language. I got to keep talking for the whole session. For some people, counting in their head is very helpful. 3 full seconds, 5 full seconds, 10 full seconds. And those can feel like the longest seconds of your life. And so there's a couple of visualization techniques. There's 2 visualization techniques that are really helpful if the counting feels distracting or hard. One, and this is one that I try and use when I'm feeling anxious and just wanting to fill the silence, is I imagine the words I said, and this sounds a little woo-woo and silly, but I imagine the words kind of filtering through the child's brain. And that helps me slow down a little bit because I'm just remembering that the information that I just said was turned into sound waves, which then turned into mechanical waves, which then needs to turn into electrical impulses, which then needs to travel and end up somewhere. So it helps me to visualize all those processes, to slow myself the heck down and just give their brain a second to filter all that information. But there's another analogy or visualization that some people find really, it feels like a good fit for them. And I tell them, I want you to imagine your child's brain as like a web page that you're trying to load. But every time you say something or ask something again or model it again, you're refreshing that page, refreshing that page, refreshing that page, and you're never fully letting the page load. So I just kind of imagine after I say something or model potential gestalt or mitigation, let the screen load. Don't hit refresh. And then the final one is really about you and your own stuff. Is interrogate your discomfort with silence. Why is silence so uncomfortable for you? Once I started investigating that, my discomfort with silence came back to my insecurities, especially about my job and being a successful speech therapist, and saying, well, if I'm not talking, am I not doing my job? And just all of that, the insecure voices, it really helped me let go and like live in the silence a little bit more comfortably. Okay. The third saliency heuristic, suprasegmental. So suprasegmentals, that is a salient phonological set of properties. What are suprasegmentals? If you haven't heard this phrase in a while, or if you're a listener of the non-live podcast recording and you say, what is that word? Suprasegmentals are these phonological features of a phrase or a sentence that extend over a series of speech segments. So it's a property of speech that extends over multiple syllables. So it kind of casts its net over a larger, like a larger part of the utterance or the whole utterance. So suprasegmentals can refer to things like pitch and melody. They can refer to juncture. They can refer to stress patterns. It's really referring to prosody. What are the prosodic features of this utterance as a whole? And juncture, let me clarify what juncture means. Juncture refers to those small pause cues that occur between sounds and words. So it's not necessarily the silence, like the larger silence markers binding the larger unit, but it's those small little pauses and breaks that help us understand where syllable differences happen and the breaks between words. I think there's a really good example that helps explain juncture, and it is the difference between an ice cream truck versus a nice cream truck. And so those are different meanings depending on where I made decisions about juncture. Now, you'll hear suprasegmentals very hard at work with performers like Miss Rachel or Blippi. These performers really know how to work their suprasegmentals, their pitch changes, their juncture cues, their stress techniques in their voice. They really deepen the meaning of what they're saying, as well as holding a child's attention. The prosody skill of performers like that, top notch. They also tend to use pretty consistent suprasegmental patterns for different types of messages that are coming through to the children. And so I'd argue that that makes their language output more predictable, which may help with memory. So super segmentals are just kind of if you think about the Miss Rachel voice, ah, da, 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 all of that, all of the motion on top of the language, that is something that also helps children to extract units, because if they hear certain contour patterns, da 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 da, it might help them think, okay, I keep hearing this person speak in ways that there's this rise, da 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 da, and then 5 minutes later, da 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 da, and then 10 minutes later, da 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 da. Oh, maybe all three of those are units. So it's kind of like the overall contour can help children notice what the patterns are and maybe pull those out. Okay, the fourth saliency heuristic. Oh, actually, no, I do not want to move on yet. I have more to say about supersegmentals. In 1978, there was a paper called The Acquisition of Morphophonology. It's by someone named Brian McWhinney. And he wrote about the concept called intonational packaging. And I really like this phrasing. And there's a quote from him. He said, quote, "Early forms will take the shape of units, which are separately packaged by intonation in the input." So this idea of shape, um, I know everyone conceives of language differently and they can kind of imagine language differently. And when I think about phrases and gestalts, I often try to imagine the shape of them in my head, which, if you're not a visual thinker, you're not a musician or an artist, might be challenging to envision what the shape of language can look like. But I like to use hand cues to kind of help myself think about the shape of language. And so if there's a child who has a gestalt like, let's see, I'm looking around the room to come up with my gestalt, but like, there's a birdhouse. I like to use my hand to kind of trace that. There's a birdhouse. Duh. There's a rise, so that rising shape. Da 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 da. And I kind of try to imagine what would that sentence look like if I were going to draw it. And so there's kind of this package, this visual package of what the words might look like if I were to draw them or imagine the shape of them. And all of this sounds very squishy, I know, but it can be a very helpful way of thinking about how we present language to a child who might need more sensory input. But this description that Brian McWhinney wrote about this intonational packaging, it really rings true for me, where I notice there's an increased acquisition of utterances, especially with GLPs, that are presented as a clear, quippy, or almost catchy sensory package. Now, I would like to think about kind of the equivalent that, if I think about like across neurotypical individuals or like the general conversation of about certain elements of language that might, I'm always trying to think of analogies or connections to explain to neurotypical parents like what gestalts might feel like. And one that stands out are famous movie quotes or memes. I mean, memes are so gestalty, but famous movie quotes, famous lines, and catchphrases from characters, they have such a clear intonational package that are easily accessed from memory, like "eat my shorts," da da da, da da da. There's such a clear intonational package there. Whereas if you contrast it to really famous quotes and speeches from historical figures that are semantically so powerful, like an MLK speech or an Abraham Lincoln speech is such powerful content, but really hard to remember, often misremembered, harder to access because they're not catchy, they're not quippy. But the things that are remembered have that quippy nature to them, and that tends to be because of the super segmentals. Now, what techniques can we use to leverage super segmentals? These are the ones that for some families I work with, they love this part. They love these techniques. And for some families I work with and some therapists I coach, this is their nightmare. And so all of these are just ideas to play with, but the main part of super segmentals is to cultivate your theatrical side. It's exploring how can you use your voice to deepen the meaning of the words you're saying. So not just saying up, but maybe up. I'm talking about upness. Can my voice also go up? Or not just saying sad, but if you're including the word sad in a potential gestalt or mitigation, sad. I'm trying to imbue the word with the emotion and deepen the meaning of it through all of these super segmentals. Now, yeah, how can I inject emotion into these words? How can I kind of embody or add shape into the words to reflect what that word actually means? I also, for some families, I talk about just pretending you're a character in a cartoon. Like, how would a cartoon character say this? How would a character from this show react in this moment? And kind of taking on that identity and embodying a character who speaks in this quippy, catchy way rather than trying to, speak as a teacher. I work with a lot of families who are like, okay, well, I really want to teach my kid this. So they start talking like a teacher. And I say, just let's experiment with and try on this idea of say it in your catchphrase voice. And the shift that happens for a lot of kids when their caregiver or their therapist goes into kind of cartoon character mode with the way that they speak, kids' heads whip around because it just sticks out in the acoustic environment. You're making your voice more salient and easier to extract. Now, it can sometimes take a while for families and therapists to feel comfortable in kind of this more theatrical, catchphrasey way of speaking, and I completely recognize that. I came into this field as a theater person, as a performer, and so for me, this was pretty natural. And so I want to completely recognize that this is not everyone's wheelhouse. This is just an idea you can take and try on, and it's something that I've found to be really, really helpful. Now, saliency heuristics 4 and 5 are tune and rhythm. And I want to package those together in my discussion because I just feel that they play so much into one another. It is hard to have a tune without rhythm. You can have rhythm without tune, but I want to talk about them in combination. Now, I consider myself to be a musical language therapist. And so these two heuristics of tune and rhythm are my favorites. Tune refers to the melody within or underlying speech. Now, you may be wondering, how would this be different from supersegmentals? Supersegmentals, there's prosody, there's melody there. And so tune heuristic at play, this is when we see a GLP who extracts the melody before the words. So you may have a client who produces these melodies and maybe walks around with what seems like jargon and maybe producing an utterance like da 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 da. That would be the tune heuristic at play, where they're extracting the tune, but there's no recognizable words in it. There's just that underlying tune. And I have clients who will walk around and they're kind of doing this whole tune and performance. And I still want to consider that a gestalt because even though we can't recognize any of the words that might be hidden within it, very likely those words are going to come out and clarify in the future. Now, easier examples to identify that have an underlying tune would be a child exclaiming, "What's that? What's that?" For what's that? Duh, duh. So it's not what's that, which would have the words layered in there, but what that? It's got the contour and the melody of it. And then there was a really funny one this morning. I feel like today there were all these fun examples of heuristics at play, or maybe I was just attending to them more because of recording the podcast tonight. But I was teaching a music class, and a child accidentally knocked over a chair, and he goes, "Ah-oh, ee-ee-owie." And we were all surprised. We didn't know what he meant. And the mom cracked up and she goes, "Oh my gosh, that's a gestalt for that was freaking scary." Because he had heard someone say that when something got knocked over. So he exclaimed his tune of it, "Ah-oh, ee-ee-ah-eh." So funny. What an entertaining gestalt. Now it's a gestalt because does that child know what freaking means? No. But it's this embedded rhythm and tune that he extracted. So this might speak to, I think, tune and rhythm, because when I said that gestalt back to myself in my head, and I've been saying it in my head all day, da 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 da, ba 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 ba. That is really, really rhythmic and very, very catchy. And so it makes sense that something so rhythmic and emotionally driven, ba 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 ba, would, as I like to say, kind of stick the landing in this kid's head, be really easy to remember. I mean, as soon as that chair hit the ground, it flew out of his mouth. He didn't even think about it. And I think the rhythmicity and the tune underneath it, and of course, if we're thinking back to the meaning, he probably heard that phrase right after something scary happened previously in his life, and his brain just went, thank you very much. I'm extracting that, and I want that in my brain forever, as I've already said. So how can we leverage tune and rhythm? First of all, use musical language. Sing, sing, sing. Use rhythmic speech when you're interacting with GLPs. Melodies are so much more memorable than many spoken sentences alone. I recommend modeling language that has interesting rhythm in it, especially eighth notes. I love a good eighth note. So da 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 da. It was freaking scary. I'll never get over that. Something that has that bounciness to it, that bouncy kind of makes your body want to move. It makes it more memorable and hopefully easier to extract. If a child is hearing relatively unpatterned speech throughout the day, and then suddenly you're speaking with the rhythm like this, it might stand out and be more salient to them. Try borrowing rhythmic sequences. Try borrowing melodies from a child's acoustic environment that they might like. Think about your favorite song. Your favorite song, let's say you are loving the Beatles and you love Hey Jude. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Da da. Da 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 da. And I think, okay, that's really catchy. Da 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 da. What words could I layer on top of that rhythm? Da 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 da. Let's go outside instead of let's go outside. Let's go outside. By kind of layering the words on top of that catchy rhythm, you may be making it easier to pay attention to and extract because you're making it more salient. Now, let's say you've got a GLP who's walking around and they're producing these tunes and they're producing these rhythms, but you don't know what the words are. I recommend acknowledging and repeating back what you do understand. And even if it's just the tune, reinforcing their attempt by saying it back to the best of your ability. And now often these strings, they do, quote, contain words. The child just may not have the articulation skills to achieve those words, or they may need to keep listening to that utterance over and over again to clarify what sounds are contained in it. But when you acknowledge it back to them, it gives them that social reinforcement that what they're saying is important and worthy of them continuing to study and try. So those were the 5 saliency heuristics: meaning, silence, supersegmentals, tune, and rhythm. And now we're going to move on to segmentation. Segmentation can occur only after a certain number of gestalts or language units have been successfully extracted and encoded. We cannot expect for robust segmentation to occur if a child does not have enough gestalts, or at least a GLP doesn't have enough gestalts. But we could also say this for analytic language processors or kids who are learning word by word. We can't expect them to engage in segmentation without a large enough corpus of units extracted. These extracted units can then, once we have enough, be filtered through segmentation strategies to break them apart. And then once they're broken apart, recombine them for these new and nuanced morphosyntactic purposes. Now, the linguistic strategies that children use may take advantage of certain heuristics about the structure of the sound relationship. And these are different heuristics than the 5 that we just talked about, but very probably kids are also using the previous 5 to help them with segmentation too. Ann Peters says about segmentation, quote, "The child needs to make a basic assumption that knowledge about them can be put to use in acquiring further knowledge about the strategies, might be used to refine and extend linguistic knowledge in 2 ways: the segmentation of extracted units into smaller units, and the perception of the structural patterns implied by these segmentations." Now, once segmentation occurs of those initial extracted gestalts or units, then the child can begin building a richer lexicon of these smaller units. With enough smaller units, the child is then setting their own stage for the future of complex morphosyntax that combines and arranges units in interesting ways. For GLPs and other children with language challenges, our segmentation supports through our vocal choices and our visual choices too can really make all the difference. And so just to summarize this page, we gotta first make sure, does this child have a wide enough corpus of extracted units for us to work with? Do we have enough raw material to turn into the next stage of the language process? Then, does the child have the segmentation strategies that they need on their own? If so, awesome, we're off. But my caseload and the kids I work with, they need more segmentation strategies and segmentation supports from us. And that is often adjusting the acoustic and visual environment to help them segment, showing them how to segment. And only then, once we've engaged in a lot of segmentation, for sometimes years of segmentation, then we can start to engage in morphosyntax because we have boiled down those units very, very small. And very, very small to the size that analytic processors, that's what they're starting with. But we have to go through that breaking down process with GLPs or help them through it. So, Ann Peters talks about segmentation heuristics, and these are internal segmentation heuristics. So internal within the extracted unit, within the extracted gestalt, now we can do internal segmentation. And that is when that child's brain is ready to do so, when they have enough gestalts to do so. In order to segment a unit into smaller ones, the child needs some heuristics for finding what we call cut points. Where do these cuts happen? Peters claims that there are certain heuristics related to phonological salience that children use, or that we as therapists or parents or teachers, that we can enhance so that those cut points can become clear. These heuristics can also create really, really sweet, adorable logical errors, especially when it comes to bound morphemes. And I'm going to give some examples of that. And I want to make it clear before we go through these 4 segmentation heuristics that I don't have any clear strategies or therapy techniques related to these heuristics. I really just want to bring your attention to them, and so you can start to better understand the errors that GLPs make in segmentation, be able to explain them to families, and also really just kind of marvel at the logic behind the errors that these kids are making and better understand how their language is developing. So the 4 internal segmentation heuristics are going to be end, E-E-E-N-D, end, begin, repetition, and stress. And again, I'm not going to give therapy techniques for these, but these are going to help us better understand what a child is producing and see where they are in their segmentation process. So first internal segmentation heuristic is end, like ending. This internal segmentation cue is when a child cuts the final syllable or morpheme off of a unit. The claim is that this segmentation occurs between that syllable because it's adjacent to silence, which would make it more salient. Think about the saliency cue of silence, and then that final syllable or final morpheme, because it's adjacent to silent, the child's brain goes, oh, let me make a cut right there. Adjacent to silence at the end of a word, slice. It may also take advantage of what's called the recency effect in psychological terms and be more easily remembered, or in cognitive terms, I mean. So there's the recency effect, it's adjacent to silence, that final syllable, child's brain says, let me make a cut right there. But let me give you some examples. An example of this with nouns, I want you to think about the nouns helper, teacher, runner. What do they all have in common? Helper, teacher, runner. Now you and I can take a step back and think, okay, that's a morpheme, and that okay. Oh, indicates a person who does something. And then the first syllable of that, help, teach, run, oh, those are verbs. So it's a person who does that thing. Cool. But a child doing their very best to make sense of the language soup, they might hear measure and treasure and think, oh, let me just cut off that ER, measure, treasure, two new verbs. So I love that example of the end heuristic. Now, just today, this is the example that, oh my God, I'm so delighted by this. A family told me that their child segmented something in a way that speaks to, I think, the end heuristic, especially the final S, so plural S. This little guy very logically segmented down the animal name fox because he thought that it was a plural. And so now he is walking around saying "fock." But as his dad laughingly said, it does not sound like "fock." I love it. So logical. And then also he started saying deers rather than deer. So he's really trying to play with plurals. And of course, fox, it sounds like a plural. It's pretty brilliant. The second internal segmentation heuristic would be begin. So we just talked about end, now we're going to talk about begin. This internal segmentation cue is when a child cuts the first syllable off of a unit, that first potential morpheme off. The claim is that this segmentation also occurs because the syllable is adjacent to silence. And it might take advantage of the opposite of the recency effect, which is the primacy effect, which is when the first thing we hear is easiest to remember. So a cute example of this might be a child who hears and builds segmentations of all done, all clean, and all over long before they ever hear the word alligator. Let's say it's a family that they don't live anywhere close to alligators. Alligators just never came up. But this child has done cool segmentation in their head of all done, all clean, all over. And then one day they hear alligator, all owl. And the child's brain thinks, oh, okay, those sound pretty similar. Oh, let me make a cut. All done, all clean, all over, all a gator. Oh, this thing must be called an igator. So they start calling it an igator. The family thinks igator is adorable, but within that very sweet error is a segmentation that has a lot of logic to it. Igator because they cut off the beginning of all, thinking that it is a separate unit. The third internal segmentation heuristic would be repetition. This heuristic is at play when children make cuts at places that have repetitious syllabic elements. The example that Peters explained was related to languages that use a lot of gender and agreement markers, and she was giving a lot of examples from other languages. And so with English, it's a heuristic I'd be really eager to explore more if and how it comes up in English. So if any listeners can think of examples, please don't hesitate to reach out about this. But she gave a great example in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, if you were to say, the big boys speak, you would do a lot of gender agreement with the syllable im. So you would say, and I'm going to say this to the best of my ability, ha yeladim, ha gdolim, medabrim, im. The repetition of that im syllable may be an easy cut for a child because it's salient, it's easier to remember, and they're hearing it over and over again. And so im. Oh, let me cut. I think that that's a syllable. That might be a morpheme. And when I'm explaining the thought processes of the child, these are all just, projected thoughts. All of this happens so implicitly in a child's brain. So again, if you can think of examples of the repetition heuristic in English, I would love to hear them. And then the final internal segmentation heuristic would be stress. This is when a child segments and cuts off a stressed syllable from the rest. And I want to share an example that might exemplify the stress heuristic. A child hears their dad, they're stuck in a traffic jam, and their dad goes, "This is unbelievable." The next week, they're stuck in traffic again, and the child yells, "Leave! Leave, Dada! Leave! Again!" The dad is confused because why is my child telling me to leave? But that previous week, the child heard, "This is unbelievable." And that stress syllable, the child's brain made a cut around the stress, thinking that that was the most important part, and thinking that that syllable leave described that moment and that context. So those are the 4 internal segmentation heuristics. So now we want to talk about frames. So structural information about language, morphosyntax, it doesn't inherently become immediately available to a child once they break things down, segment down. The way that words and morphemes go together in a structural hierarchy is something that takes many exposures to kind of understand the math behind language. Now, the idea of a frame or a formula is a really exciting therapeutic opportunity that we can use to bring some more and clearer order to the type of language structures we want to build early on. With all of the competing structures, there's so many ways that words and morphemes can go together. There are untold combinations. Frames and formulas give us a little bit more direction to help a child clue into those structures. Frames, in my opinion, have a balance of consistency and variability. I like to think about slot and frame dynamics in terms of containers and contents. Some containers, some sentence types, can hold a whole range of items or substances. Think about like a giant box can hold a lot of different contents, whereas certain containers or maybe certain types of sentences, there are very select things that can fit in them. The same goes for language structures. Now, frames, they're different from lexical units because they contain a variable or they contain several variables, but there is importantly a predictable structure to them that may support the memory needed for language tasks. And we think about the autistic neurotype I talked about in a previous episode. The autistic neurotype has an inherent working memory deficit or difference. And so we can use frames, language frames and formulas to help as a support for that working memory deficit or difference. A shared common subunit is a helpful structural pattern for children to be able to notice when they're perceiving and constructing language. If a child is able to assume that these language frames, which have probably been generalized from repeated instances of hearing that construction, if they can assume that that construction will continue to recur, they may be able to then use that knowledge of, oh, I think I'm going to hear that sentence type again. I think I'm going to hear that order of words again, even if it's not the exact words, but word types in that same order. Okay, I think people are going to keep saying that same order again and again. They can also use that as a segmentation aid. So I'm going to speak to 2 final heuristics related to frames. One is frame segmentation, and one is frame evaluation. So first up is we're going to do frame evaluation. When a sentence frame or formula is heard often, maybe something like, let's go to the blank, or I want blank, or give me some blank. That would be a frame. You can fill in something new. Things fit in a way that is a little more predictable than just novel sentence after novel sentence. When a frame or formula is heard often with new words slotted in to a certain space, kind of like a fill in the blank or a Mad Libs, a child may start to anticipate or expect a larger range of words to be able to fill that slot. This is through expectation. The child may use the strategy of, okay, I've heard a lot of different words fill in, like look at the bird, look at the book, look at the mama. So the child may use a strategy of thinking, okay, what else could I slot into that? Let me try something new in there. They might put in their own ideas that they think have something in common with the words that they've already heard slotted in. Now, this can lead to really impressive moments where you're like, oh my gosh, yes, that word does go there. But it can also lead to really hilarious moments when children slot in words that to them have total logic. And then we can then have the delight and enjoyment of thinking, oh my gosh, yes, they're trying to engage the sentence formula to the best of their ability. Now, I see this process happen a lot with nursery rhymes. And I think nursery rhymes are a concrete way of thinking about this, especially because a lot of people know the same nursery rhymes. Lyrics, in my opinion, are an excellent place to help a GLP build their language flexibility. What I call lyrical mitigation or lyrical formulas, I find them appealing because music has structure to it that can make slots easier to predict and easier to fill in. Now, in addition to being an SLP, I'm also a music teacher, and this gives me a really large experiential data set of how often, like every class, songs like Wheels on the Bus and Old MacDonald lead to these amazing slot moments for children that often surprise their parents. So when I think about these two songs, Wheels on the Bus and Old MacDonald, both of these songs have two slots or two variables at play. So wheels on the bus. The wheels on the bus go round and round. I'm going to put the word blank where the variable is. The blank on the bus goes blank, blank, blank. So there's two variables. The thing that's on the bus and then the thing it does or the sound it makes. Same thing with Old MacDonald. There's two variables at play. And on that farm he had a blank, E-I-E-I-O, with a blank blank here and a blank blank there. So animal, and then the thing that it says, two variables at play. In each verse, a child is tasked with subbing in two related words, animal, then sound, or bus element / bus person, and then action or sound related to it. These songs give children an opportunity, all children, an opportunity to engage with formulas in a predictable patterned way, where each of the two variables have a relationship with one another. Now, it's really exciting to see when a child realizes that they can fill in the first slot with any animal or any person or any part of the bus. They then need to adjust the second variable to match the characteristics of the first. This is language decision making, and it is fascinating to witness it in real time. When a child slots in, and this is so much fun to do in music class, especially music class with GLPs. So when a child, or even I, if I'm doing it as a therapy activity, I will slot in a noun that doesn't have a distinct or obvious word for that second related slot. It gives us this exciting opportunity to model something that can grow their vocabulary because we're using frame evaluation. I'll never forget the music class when I was doing Old MacDonald and a child yelled out giraffe. And then there's this panicked look on their face because they realized they didn't know what sound a giraffe made, and neither did I. Nobody did. But the show has to go on, and a musical, musical SLP, she can't help herself. What a great opportunity. And so I thought, okay, let me take this formula. And on this farm, he had a giraffe, E-I-E-I-O. And I thought, if I don't know what the sound is, can I modify that slot? Can I modify that variable for something else? And I said, okay, let's put a verb there instead. I'm going to do stretch. with a stretch here and a stretch there, putting our arms up really high to look like a giraffe neck. And I will never forget the look of joy on that child's face because we were doing a slot and frame and the modified slot. But what happened after was even better. Because other children, for the next verses, they started slotting in even sillier animals, and as well as entities that they'd never heard in that song before. One child said leaf. On that farm, he had a leaf, and so we had to come up with what would a leaf sound like or what would a leaf do. And it went from the song that everybody knows the words to a true language activity. Now, here's a client from just yesterday that was engaging with a frame or a formula. I'm going to call him Jay. Jay was standing in his living room holding a crocodile toy, and he looked at me and said, "Row, row, row your boat." Now I paused and I realized, okay, there's a connection. He's holding this animal and he's asking for the song. Oh, he's probably requesting that I do the crocodile verse of this song that involves a very silly scream because he thinks it's hilarious when I make a fool of myself. So I sang that verse, which is row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. If you see a crocodile, don't forget to scream. I am not going to scream on the podcast. No, thank you. I sang that verse and Jay was beaming with excitement because I understood the request. I understood the assignment. Halfway through singing, I noticed a pile of other animals behind him. And I said, okay, I can create this repetitious frame activity with these verses where different animals appear along the boat route. Now, I knew I was taking a risk because this is a child where if I deviate from an idea or a plan in his head, he gets very, very upset. I think it's very distressing when someone else comes in with a different idea. So I knew I was taking a chance and I fully expected to be rejected. Expect the reject. And I was, he might have had a next verse he wanted me to do. Like, I was ready for it. But what happened next blew me away, and it just reminded me of the power of frames. When we provide something predictable, but we modify the contents just a little bit. So I tried it because I saw that there was a snake toy in the ground. I said, row, row, row your boat gently down the lake. If you see a snake, don't forget to shake. So the formula was very similar, but I subbed in a different body of water and a different animal. Now, this child who only a couple weeks ago would have probably screamed, no, at this deviation, he looked at me with curiosity. He looked at the pile and he began to sing, row, row, row your boat gently down the river. If you see a shark, don't forget to scream. And he was so excited, and I was blown away. He recognized that I had created a new slot with stream for a different body of water, and that allowed him to take that slot and put in another body of water. So we went from stream to lake to river. The way he produced the word river was really a giveaway to me of how he was thinking about it. It wasn't river, it was river. I imagine him kind of searching the file folder of his brain for another body of water word. He chose that word to fill that space. Now, we continued these verses through about a dozen other animals, and then something even cooler happened. He started slotting in words I couldn't understand, and they really seemed to me and his dad like nonsense words. And I feel like he was trying to create rhymes with what that final verb could be. It was such a cool experience for a child who just a couple weeks ago was so distressed by changing the lyrics of any song. But because of the power of frames with this perfect mix of predictability and novelty, I think he felt safe enough to play around with language. Now, the next heuristic would be the segmentation frame. This heuristic is when a child uses a known frame that they have as a kind of template to segment a new utterance. So what I was doing with the client Jay and with the song lyrics was I was using frames with all words that the child probably already knew. But the segmentation with frames is when a child acquires a new word or a new unit by segmenting it out of a frame. So let me explain more. This may happen when they hear a word that is occupying kind of a constant position, and then the thing that is adjacent to the constant position, they recognize, okay, this is probably something novel. Let me pull it out. So a very common example is more plus entity or more plus noun. So many kids hear more apple, more ball, more hugs. It has this formula for a desirable entity. And it gives them this clear pattern that can then help them segment new words. If they hear it all the time with words they already know, like more dada, more water, then when they hear more with something they don't know, it'll be easier to pull it off. For example, let's say a child is at a restaurant and their grandmother says, "Darling, do you want more tiramisu?" But that child does not know what tiramisu is. However, their statistical exposure to more plus noun will help them segment off tiramisu as a smaller unit. They don't think it's more tiramisu as one unit. They have the statistical relationship with more, and they say, okay, I think tiramisu might be the name of that thing in front of me that I don't know the name of. Now, I see this happen very often with adjectives and descriptors. So like big plus entity, mama plus entity, mama bear, mama toucan, big box, big ball, yucky plus entity. At first, Peters describes that children see each of these as independent formulas. Big blank, mama blank, yucky blank, more blank. And then later on, children realize, and again, most of this is implicit, that these are actually part of a larger formula of property plus noun. So that's where segmentation can come in when it comes to frames. Now, when it comes to practicing and building your skills with frames, which may seem like there's untold amount of frames, I'm so overwhelmed. How do I use frames in my modeling? I want to start building your skill in recognizing them and manipulating them. So I'm going to give you a practice method that I use with families and when I'm coaching other therapists. When it comes to trying to build a better understanding of how a GLP might be perceiving and manipulating frames, I want to go back to the basics. Grab pen and paper, grab a whiteboard and a marker. I want you to start writing down gestalts or writing down the utterances that you have in mind. And look at that utterance in front of you as a potential formula, a PF. I say, okay, let's PF it. If there's an utterance, write it down. We're going to PF it, guys. Once I write it down, I want to think about what are the parts of speech in front of me? Nouns, verbs, adjectives, pronouns. Let's break it down. What's in front of me? What are the component parts of this string of sounds and what order do they go in? Now, if grammar is not an area you know much about, and listen, hey, SLPs, if you identify with this, I see you and your grad program not teaching linguistics. And listen, they have a lot they have to get in. I get it. But you feel embarrassed that this is not a strong area for you. I see you. Right now, I'm giving you an actionable opportunity to build your skills. I'm not judging. So the first place I recommend is nouns, because nouns are concrete, and so many GLPs are noun lovers. Think about how many stage 1 GLPs don't look like stage 1 because they have hundreds of single words, and those are within their preferred categories related to their special interests. But think about back to pen and paper using nouns. Once I write down a gestalt or potential mitigation or potential gestalt, I look to see where the nouns are and I underline them. I physically underline them. Then I ask myself, can this noun location reasonably act as a slot for other nouns? If I use this location as a slot, secondly, can I think of a reasonable opportunity to model the new utterance with the slotted word? So a gestalt like, he's eating an apple, has, in my opinion, a prime noun slot because it can create a variety of new utterances related to eating. He's eating a blank. He's eating a blank. But we see this in contrast to kind of that classic example from Marge Blanc's book of To Infinity and Beyond. The noun slot there of infinity, it's pretty limiting in its potential meanings. Now, if you find when you've underlined that there is a reasonable slot for a new utterance creation in what you've written down, then I recommend actually rewriting the utterance with the blank line so your brain knows what to fill in. Now, you may also write new utterance ideas in a list too for your language interaction. He's eating a pineapple. He's eating a, and writing down those examples, because that's giving yourself a written support. And that's going to reduce your cognitive load when you're actually engaging in the back and forth therapeutically or with your own child. And I have a lot of families who have actually gotten whiteboards for their house to write down the frames that they want to be modeling, so they don't have to think about it on the fly. They've got examples already. Now, I do the same with verbs. I also prioritize verb slots in my formula modeling because so many GLPs learn well when they're in motion. And I think about what verbs in this utterance, or are there any verbs that have the best potential to act as a slot? So for example, the Gestalt, he's eating an apple, has an auxiliary verb that's implied in he's, but that's a really limiting verb slot because it would only really come down to was and has been. He was eating an apple. He has been eating an apple. But the main verb, eating, that has a lot of possibilities. Cutting, biting, tasting, smelling, throwing. There's more plentiful options for that slot than the auxiliary slot. But I also want to think about how many of those are actually reasonable for the child in front of me. Are we actually going to talk about apples a lot? Because if I'm subbing out just the verb, we might only hit 5, which is great in the kitchen or the grocery store. But beyond that, that actually makes me think about, do I want to open up 2 variables? Maybe the noun and the verb. He's blanking a blank. Now, this is going to tax their memory a little bit more, but it leads us to this unbelievable expansion of possibilities. And so that's another decision-making point is, do I want to open up 1 variable or 2? And I try not to go beyond that too much when I'm thinking about the clients, at least I'm working with. Then I'm thinking about older GLPs. We're working with a lot of different slots within a certain frame. They don't even really look like frames anymore. But in the early parts, just think about 1 or 2 slots to play around with. Now, anecdotally and interestingly, I've noticed that people who think in words, and you might be a person who thinks in words, you might be a person who thinks in pictures, you might be a little bit of both, but I found that people who think in words tend to do pretty well with this technique of writing it down, underlying, and doing the analysis of where slots can go in these frames. But people who think in pictures, they tend to benefit from writing out and doing the writing out strategy for longer. This process of analyzing utterances and analyzing potential utterances for these potential slots, it gets faster and easier with practice, I promise. I'm at the point now where I can do this in real time, no pen and paper, at conversational speed with the child in front of me, because I can see the sentences in my brain. When I hear them, when I think them, I can see the slots and just sub them in and out. That's come from a lot of practice, also being someone who thinks in words. But the practice that you put into this, the more you build this skill, it'll be easier to do this on the fly with GLPs. And we know that being improvisational and in the moment is so important with GLPs. But you can do that back end work of writing it out, underlying, and having it up and within view. I find that to be really, really helpful. I invite you to start practicing this so that you can increase your speed and comfort too. So what did we talk about in this episode? We talked about extraction, segmentation, heuristics. We talked about frames, and it all comes back to that seminal work by Ann Peters called Units of Language Acquisition. I highly recommend reading it. I really appreciate you taking the time to either listen to this episode or join in on one of our streaming platforms. If you would like to connect with me and talk more about GLP, musical language therapy, and all that good stuff, please come find me on Instagram. I am at crescendo.communication or at crescendocommunication.com. Once again, I'm Corinne Zmoos. I am a speech language pathologist and musician who is very passionate about GLPs, and I hope you'll join again for another episode of the Gestalt Get Together. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again at another speech therapy PD course. Thanks, everybody.